morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the FERC Order 1920 Compliance Update. After we finish the Compliance Update presentation, we're going to go into the stakeholder discussion on rescoping competitive solicitation transmission projects with approved project sponsors. And we have a separate presentation there, and we'll have both presentations are listed in the event in the calendar for today. So you can look at that event and you can pull up the presentations on your own as well. My name is Elena Coppola-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm joined by Neil Miller, VP in Transmission Planning and Infrastructure Development, Danielle Mills, Principal, Infrastructure Policy Development, Biju Gopi, Senior Manager in Transmission Interface Coordination, Jeff Billington, Director of Transmission Planning and Infrastructure Development, and Sarah Kozel, Senior Counsel, Federal Regulatory and Markets. So just a quick reminder that the materials are listed either under the miscellaneous page on our website, or you can get to both of them with the calendar event. So I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This collaborative meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but please keep your comments respectful and professional, and please try to be brief and refrain from what's already been said so we can manage our time efficiently this morning. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. They are listed as Insalore Events, and today's producer is Stacy. For raising your hand, make sure you first open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right of your screen, and you'll be able to see the raised hand icon at the bottom of the participant panel. If you joined outside the WebEx, you can press *3 to get into the question queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation before you make your comments or ask your question. And you can send the question in the chat to all panelists. And we'll read that out loud for you. And here I'm going to hand it over to Danielle Bell.
Thanks, Elena. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this first update of our plans to comply with Order 1920 and 1920A. I want to start with just a brief summary of what the order requires of transmission planners. And maybe just at a high level to, emphasize that we view this order as being important for transmission planning across the country, but also explains a lot of practices that the ISO already has in place. And so, while this is an important order and one that we intend to comply with fully, it is something that does not constitute fundamental changes to our transmission planning process as much as it does maybe some minor adjustments and resequencing of our transmission planning process, both regional and interregional. So with that in mind, I'll just kind of walk through what the order does, and we can talk through some of the specifics on how we plan to comply as we get into the details. But the Commission issued Order 1920 in May of 2024 to address the need for long-term transmission planning and associated discussions around cost allocation. The order does build on previous orders, including Order 1000, and ensures consistent approaches to developing long-term transmission plans that should result in efficient and cost-effective transmission solutions. Order 1920A, an amended version, was issued in November of last year, which really, again, didn't change the fundamentals of the original order's requirements, but enhanced the role of relevant state entities and states in general in these discussions around transmission planning and in their involvement in development of long-term transmission plans. We'll go to the next slide, please. So the order does require transmission providers, importantly, to conduct long-term planning for regional transmission facilities. And when we say long-term transmission planning, that's over a 20-year time horizon in order to anticipate future needs and determine how to pay for those transmission facilities. As hopefully most of you are aware, the ISO already does a 20-year transmission plan. We do it sort of on a voluntary basis. We started it in 2022 and did an update in 2024. This order now requires that longer term 20-year plan. It identifies factors for consideration for the development of the scenarios and the benefits criteria for determining the long-term transmission solutions. It requires us to look at 3 plausible scenarios, and those must be studied with each scenario stress tested to account for extreme weather as a sensitivity. Transmission providers have to develop these 20-year plans at least every 5 years. In the past, we've been doing them every 2. We've only done 2. So we'll look at the schedule for how often we complete these 20-year plans. And the order also requires that we update interregional coordination processes for sharing information and identifying and jointly evaluating longer-term interregional transmission facilities. Go to the next slide, please. Aside from the longer-term 20-year planning, the order enhances the role of state regulators in the long-term regional transmission planning process, particularly in terms of their involvement in shaping scenario development and cost allocation. I'll also note, too, that the order does require consultation with tribes in development of the long-term regional transmission plans as well. So we'll be working that into our process more holistically. It also requires an engagement period for discussions with relevant state entities around cost allocation. And the amended order allows relevant state entities to seek an extension of up to 6 additional months based on the progress of discussions around cost allocation. The order also requires local transmission inputs into the regional transmission planning process to enhance transparency and to help right-size facilities, and requires addressing generation interconnection related needs that have arisen multiple times but have not yet been resolved. As we've seen with other recent FERC orders and as the ISO has already been doing in our transmission planning process, the order also requires consideration of the use of grid enhancing technologies in the transmission planning process. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this 6-month engagement period that's required with relevant state entities. Again, the engagement period is really intended to focus exclusively on long-term regional transmission cost allocation and or a state agreement process. When we say regional transmission cost allocation, we're talking about costs for projects that are 200 kV and greater and are combined for the ISO area and collected by the ISO through uniform system-wide rates. We have engaged in this. We've started this engagement period. It began November 1st, and we intend for it to close on May 1st. We've had 2 meetings with the relevant state entities and have been very candid in those meetings that given the relative simplicity of the ISO balancing area being largely within the state of California, the ISO is not anticipating any significant changes to our regional cost allocation methodology. So we are not proposing any changes to the transmission access charge, and we haven't heard so far any expectation from the relevant state entities that we seek or propose changes to the regional cost allocation either. So that process is going smoothly. We expect it to close May 1st. We will go into some other changes that we're anticipating on the next slide, please. So separate from the transmission cost allocation discussions, we are thinking through how we can meet the new requirements of this order. Again, it won't fundamentally change our transmission planning process, but it does require a number of new specific details as we develop our scenarios and go through the process. And so in order to meet those requirements, we will need to sort of adjust the sequencing and the timeline of our annual transmission planning process, which is currently on an overlapping 15-month planning cycle. Another important piece of this is how we coordinate this process going forward with our neighboring planning regions of West Connect and Northern Grid. And I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but the CREPC state entities that represent West Connect and Northern Grid did seek an extension for West Connect and Northern Grid to comply with Order 1920 and 1920A of 6 months. And so yesterday, the ISO also requested a 6-month extension of our Order 1920 compliance plan or compliance filing in order to make sure that as we develop this new schedule, we're developing it with these other regional planning regions in mind and able to develop a schedule that allows us to share information on the interregional planning process and the interregional level so that we're able to potentially act on those transmission projects in the future. So this table looks at the requirements of the order and envisions kind of a new transmission planning process that would run over essentially 4 years and meet the requirements of Order 1920. And I'll turn it here to Biju Gopi, who can talk through what this table means and how we are thinking about compliance thus far. None of this is final by any means, but just sort of our latest thinking and discussions around this order.
Daniel, so as Daniel mentioned, it involves resequencing of how we do in terms of the periodicity of transmission planning process. And in terms of the comprehensive transmission planning process that we currently undertake at CAISO, as you all know, it's an annual process, actually a 15-month process. So we are looking to expand the annual comprehensive transmission plan every 2 years, as opposed to an annual process. So that the entire gamut of reliability, policy, and economic studies, as you know, currently would be spread over 2 years, as opposed to the current annual cycle that we follow. But it does not mean that we would not look at concerns or reliability concerns that we would have on a regular basis, on an annual basis. For example, a load forecast in a certain local area that needs to be addressed and cannot wait for the entire 2 years. So that would be looked at in terms of the reliability analysis, which would be conducted every year, so to speak. There are NERC reliability standards compliance that we would need to follow for an annual compliance to reliability standards related to TPL 001, for example. We would be doing deliverability studies and RA studies and local capability requirement studies, LCR studies on an annual basis, as well as those are mandated and required to follow an annual cycle. So those would still continue on the cadence of an annual process. So that's what you have at the bottom end of some of the studies that we want to continue on an annual basis. And as Daniel mentioned, we would be following a 4-year cycle. The order allows at least 5 years, so we would be following a 4-year cycle in terms of the 20-year plan, in developing the 20-year plan and kind of going through the scenarios, working through the scenarios and sensitivities associated with it. And so that will go on a 4-year cycle. So that's how we are planning to move forward in terms of resequencing the transmission planning process, as you currently are aware of at CAISO. So I'll pause there, and that's just providing a high-level view of the table that's in front of you for the moment. And happy to take any questions later on, or if you break for questions. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. Back to you.
Thanks. We do have one hand from Pushkar from a few slides ago. If Danielle, if you'd like to take a question right now.
Daniel, good morning. This is Pushkar Wagle from Clean Resource Consultants. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you very much for kicking this engagement period in general and keeping us stakeholders informed about the development. I think you've pretty much captured most of the key elements in your summary of the FERC Orders 1920 and 20A, but I noticed that there was one element order related to the reevaluation of the long-term regional transmission facilities, which basically requires that in the event of delays and cost overruns, there should be a reevaluation of long-term regional transmission facilities that were previously selected in the regional transmission plan. Was there a specific reason that wasn't in your summary, or I don't know, is there a change? Probably mostly the 1920A, if I understand correctly, is basically reinforce most of the elements of 1920. So just was curious as to that element wasn't there, but clearly you had captured most of the key elements in the summary.
Yeah, good question, Pushkar. Go ahead.
Thanks, Daniel. Sorry. And then Pushkar, there are a lot of recommendations in the order and directives. And what we did was just to capture at a high level some key elements. And so we weren't really trying to focus on the 100 or 200 odd directives that are there in order both 1920 and 1920A. So hope that helps.
Understood. I think that's what I thought. Clearly, you're not trying to exclude anything there. It's just that I just thought that that was also one of the key elements when it comes to the long-term regional transmission plan. And I don't want to sort of discuss the 1920A. I haven't gone through the whole thing, but basically, I think your bullet number that calls for the role of state in terms of the development of the scenarios and those elements. I think is that the key element in 20A that relative to 1920 that sort of gives more role for states to play there. Do I understand that correctly?
So my read of it is that Order 1920, the original Order 1920, did require a strong role of states and anticipate and envision states being involved in the scenario development process. I think Order 1920A adds some opportunities for state involvement in terms of extending the window for engagement with relevant state entities and discussions around cost allocation in particular. I'll see if others from the ISO want to weigh in on that as well.
It's Neil here. I would just chime in as well too that when we look at the state entity engagement, we went into this probably exceeding in terms of our coordination with the relevant state entities, anything that's in 1920 or 1920A. This was really focused though on the dissatisfactions, and especially with some of the FERC commissioners about the dissatisfactions in some jurisdictions where there's very limited opportunity for state input. But as Danielle said at the beginning, that we see that there really are no new concepts being explored here relevant to the ISO. We're already achieving those, but this order was really raising the bar on a national basis. So there are these additional requirements being put into the in the order, but we're not seeing that requiring much in the way of additional interaction given the already extensive coordination we have in place with the relevant state entities today.
Agreed. Thank you, Neil. That's all I had, Daniel. No more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Pushkar. We have a question in the chat from Mike Florio of Florio Consulting. Is there a sense of when the first year with only the light reliability analysis would be?
Do you want to address that?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. So the reliability analysis will occur on an annual basis, so that will be every year. And so the idea is that we would do the comprehensive transmission planning every 2 years, obviously, as you know, with the current, just kind of expanding the current TPP process. But we do want to capture any reliability concerns that we would see on an annual basis without having to wait for the 2-year process. And I think that's the key piece around why we would do reliability analysis every year, to make sure that we are kind of on top of load forecasts and resource projections and everything else, as opposed to waiting for the complete 2-year process to play out. So that's the idea, that we would do reliability analysis on an annual basis.
Okay, thank you. And then we have one hand from Fernando.
Hi, good morning. Appreciate the update. So this is very helpful. I just had a process question. For the CAISO filing yesterday at FERC seeking the 6-month additional time to comply with Order 1920, and it largely refers to the CRESP filing and the need for additional time in both, as you pointed out, Northern Grid and West Connect. And it seems like the primary driver is to have that alignment, at least from the regional planning standpoint, for interregional projects eventually. But how does that reconcile with your bullets here in terms of the summary of what the requirements are from Order 1920 and the ability to extend that 6-month engagement window that would be done by the request of state regulators? Did we get state regulators in California or in the CAISO footprint to request or to seek that additional time? I'm just curious.
So it's a good question. I think there's a distinction here between the role of state regulators in requesting additional time for compliance filings regarding the transmission cost allocation discussions, and the reason for our filing, which was more on the interregional level, and the need to make sure that this schedule in the table on this slide works with the schedules that Northern Grid and WestConnect developed. So, and I'll see if Sarah wants to opine on sort of the legal side of this, but our understanding was we could seek the extension on the grounds of the need to comply with the interregional components and to have a process that works and allows us to share information on the same timelines essentially as WestConnect and Northern Grid, rather than really needing the state entities to make this request for us on the grounds of the transmission cost allocation discussions.
Okay.
Danielle, that's clear.
Okay, I guess I was reading a little bit more explicitly here in terms of who would initiate that type of request, and given your update that there's been apparently 2 relevant state entity agency meetings so far, and things have gone well, and then we're seeking, or the CAISO seeking, a 6-month additional time. And I understand the reasoning. I mean, it makes sense, but I was just curious as to the feedback from the state agencies, that if they had any concerns or wanted additional time for that discussion on the allocation portion of the requirements to be extended. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And Fernando,
go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, can you introduce yourself to Fernando, what organization you're with?
I'm with Southern California Edison.
Thank you.
And I was just going to clarify, I don't want to speak for any of the relevant state entities, but we have not heard an indication that they will be seeking more time for those transmission cost allocation discussions.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. I see Pushkar, is that a new hand? Stacy, can we unmute Pushkar? I want to check his hand went down and then back up.
Yes, I do. This is Pushkar Wagle from Field Resource Consultants. I do have one quick question for Biju. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Biju, in terms of the reliability analysis, that's pretty clear in terms of you're saying that would be, and that's a good thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. But you also included the deliverability studies. Now, typically, the on-peak deliverability assessments and those kind of studies are done to determine the policy analysis that you're proposing that you'll do presumably every second year, more sort of. But clearly, deliverability studies are done for transmission plan deliverability allocation studies and those. So when you say deliverability studies, you mean all those routine deliverability studies that you may have to do besides what are also done for policy studies. Did I get that right?
That is correct, Pushkar. Yeah.
Okay. And so routine, all the LCR studies would be on an annual basis, those kind of deliverability annual basis and reliability. Understood. Thanks for clarifying that. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Pushkar. So we don't have any other hands at this time.
Okay, thanks. In that case, we can go to the next slide, I think. Okay, so I didn't want to bury the lead on this, but I think this is hopefully familiar to you all now. The ISO is seeking an extension for compliance to align with the other WEC regional planning entities. I think I mentioned that. I will just see. So we are requesting a similar 6-month extension for compliance. So it would be December 12th for the, if we are granted that request, it would be December 12th for the compliance filing and February 11th for the compliance filing on interregional planning. And I will go to the next slide too, unless there are questions on that. And that's all we have for you today. So happy to take any questions or feedback that you all have in this forum. And I imagine we'll have another stakeholder meeting also once we're closer to our compliance filing to share any updates or changes.
Okay, we have one hand from Jane.
Hi, hope you can hear me. This is Jane with the Public Advocate's Office. We wanted to check on any status update in CAISO's interpretation of its 1920 compliance with competitive bidding projects. We had submitted an initiative into the stakeholder policy initiative process last year, kind of basically making a request for CAISO to consider new voltage thresholds for its competitive bidding projects. And, you know, CAISO's response at that time was that the regional benefits and, you know, the kind of consideration of competitive bidding is closely tied to provisions and components of the 1920 order, and would be considering it further as it kind of figured out compliance with 1920. So we wanted to just check in on that and see if you did end up coming to any conclusions on whether a change in your competitive bidding process as it is now is needed to comply with 1920, or, you know, exploration of your current process, if that's, you know, if you're already complying, or you would consider competitive bidding elsewhere. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. I don't think that we are anticipating changes to our competitive solicitation threshold at this point under Order 1920. And I think that's still in compliance with the order and with 1920A as well. But we're still happy to have that discussion with you. I think if there were to be additional discussion of it, it would probably not actually fall in Order 1920, but maybe part of the future transmission planning process. So the 2025-2026 transmission planning process, where we're kind of taking new stakeholder ideas and concepts and exploring them.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that, I just am wondering, did you like kind of determine that your existing process does comply with 1920, or are you just finding that it's maybe, after reading all the provisions and the orders, it's not completely relevant to this particular conversation? Like, you don't need to look at your competitive bidding process in order to ensure compliance with 1920.
I think it's both,
okay,
to some extent, and I can see if Sarah has any additional thoughts on that. But I don't think Order 1920 requires any additional exploration of changing those thresholds or any direction on what the thresholds should be. So I think if there were to be any change, it would have to be in a separate filing. But I'm not an attorney.
Yeah, that's right, Danielle. And obviously, you know, we're still working through our compliance, but at this point, we don't see any requirement to change that via 1920, those thresholds via 1920.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. We have a hand from Mike.
Yes, there were also provisions in 1920.
Hi, Mike. Will you introduce yourself before we go into your question? Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. There were provisions in 1920 about benefits that were supposed to be considered in the economic analysis that, you know, at first blush seemed a little more extensive than what the team methodology currently considers. Is there any thought to relooking at team and seeing if you have to quantify additional transmission benefits beyond the ones that are considered now?
It's Neil here. I could take a shot at that. So Mike, I have to admit, as we look over that list, we've always believed that the ISO's list of potential benefits for consideration was probably among the broadest of any of the ISOs and RTOs. If it does require modification, we'll of course comply we are going to be doing a compliance filing on this, and if we do need to expand the categories, then we will. It looked like there's a great deal of additional documentation necessary, but whether or not it actually shifts the dial on additional benefits that would rationalize moving forward with additional projects, I'm not sure we're seeing that yet, but that's something we'll have to take into account as we go through all the detail of the filing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And we just got a hand from Ian. Ian, go ahead and please introduce yourself first.
Hi, this is Ian Kearney with Golden State Clean Energy. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
All right. Yeah, just a question on if you have any sense of when the first year might be that you would not be not have a transmission plan coming out of this, given the new 2-year cycle.
Teacher, you want to take that?
I can try. I think we're still working through the details at this point, Ian. We've got the extension request that we filed with FERC yesterday in concert with, the CRIPC filing for Northern Grid and West Connect. So we want to make it a coordinated effort. So once we get some more clarity around the starting point for all 3 Western planning regions, we'll be in a better position to come out with a more firm schedule as we work through some of the details.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have any other hands at this time.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions on Order 1920 and 1920A compliance, we did want to have a separate discussion with stakeholders around how to rescope competitive solicitation transmission projects when project sponsors have already been approved. So I'll maybe just do one final call on the Order 1920 piece before we move into this separate topic.
And just a reminder that the raise hand icon is hidden in this form of WebEx. You have to open the participant panel on the bottom right of your screen, and it's at the bottom of that panel once that opens up. Or you can add your question in the chat. Yeah, Danielle, I'm not seeing any other hands.
Okay, thanks. Neil, do you want to go to the next slide? Oh, and you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Yes, I can jump in on this and walk through the topic here. And, just to reiterate what Danielle said, is this is a separate and distinct topic. It's not a compliance filing, Order 1920 compliance filing issue. It did come up because of a result of a fairly recent set of events. That was an issue we did, in response to some stakeholder calls and concerns, we did want to jump on as quickly as possible. So we were somewhat shamelessly taking advantage of the fact that our stakeholder community would be getting together today to bring this topic up as well. But the comments will be fed in separately, and this issue will be addressed separately outside of any 1920 compliance filing. So really the issue that came up was, well, we've had to amend projects that had been, or rescope projects that had been assigned to incumbent transmission utilities. More recently, we had the first experience of where we had to make material changes to the scope of competitively awarded projects. Those changes went through a stakeholder process. They were subsequently approved by our Board of Governors, subject to the terms of transmission planning decisions. And then the management subsequently negotiated the changes with the approved project sponsor. Now, as I mentioned, well, we've had to amend projects that have been assigned to incumbent transmission owners before, and we have also had to cancel competitively awarded projects in the past due to changing circumstances. This was actually the first time where we needed to modify but continue with a competitively awarded project. Now, as a result of those changes, and generally we had support for the changes themselves, but we did get requests for clarity as to, on a going forward basis, how we decide at the ISO when to amend a competitively awarded project scope versus canceling it outright and rebidding an alternative in the future. If I could move to the next slide, please. So we saw this really needing to address three questions here. First is, what's the process by which we determine changes are needed and put those changes into effect? The second is, what are the considerations we take into account in deciding whether to cancel a project and rebid an alternative or negotiate a modification to the awarded project? And the third question that came to mind is, what additional process clarity can we provide to our stakeholders about how these are accomplished, and how should that clarity be provided? Next slide, please. Regarding the first question about what's the process for determining when a change in scope is needed and to put those changes into effect, we do have in our current framework the planning authority to change or cancel a previously approved project, and that's conducted through an open and transparent planning process that ultimately culminates in approval by the Board of Governors. Those reviews are conducted on a case-by-case basis when the ISO or stakeholders identify a material change in circumstance. Now, once the Board of Governors approves the changes in scope, management is responsible for implementing the change, either by notifying an incumbent PTO for the projects that were not competitively awarded, or for projects that were competitively awarded, canceling the original project and rebidding, or negotiating a change in scope with the existing approved sponsor. So that's how the responsibilities within the ISO fall out for actually deciding a change is needed and moving forward. Next slide, please. So the part about deciding whether to cancel a project or rebid an alternative versus negotiating a modification or taking some other action, you know, we did have to be clear that there is no single simple bright line test here to say, well, this is clearly one and this is clearly the other. Rather, this, in our view, is the need where we need to weigh the different considerations and land on an appropriate decision. Now, the considerations that we've been thinking of to this point can include issues like the magnitude of the scope change itself, the urgency of the need, the progress towards completing the original project, and especially the components that need to continue moving forward or are relevant even with the revised scope, and also the ability and willingness of the existing approved project sponsor to negotiate reasonable changes to the approved project sponsor agreement, at least in keeping with the intent of the original award, and to complete the revised scope. So these are the issues we've been considering and thinking of to this point as being relevant. But this is something we can look for additional input on. If I could move to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of providing some additional clarity to stakeholders about that list I just walked through and how we go through that process, we are considering whether we should be adding some additional clarity, perhaps in the transmission planning business practice manual on that, because this was not a topic that was getting a lot of process clarity being provided before on, and to be frank, it's the first time we actually had to go through this type of change. We did see that given that there is not a clean, bright line to draw, that we did believe that the tariffs seemed a bit too rigid and inflexible, given that these considerations are more in the nature of guidance and making decisions under the tariff framework we already have in place. I also wanted to mention, just to reiterate what I said before, was that this is not a tariff compliance issue, so it's not relevant to FERC Order 1920, 1928 compliance issues, just to be clear. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions I can help. Oh, sorry, I believe there's a wrap-up slide. Next slide, please. So the next steps on this was that we were looking for comments in response to the questions and how we were looking at addressing these questions. And as we said, our thought was that we could provide some additional clarity through the transmission planning business practice manual, which would also require, of course, going through that change process for BPMs. We did want to get your thoughts on this, so we would appreciate comments on this presentation being sent to the regional transmission mailbox that's identified here. And we'd only make a decision about having another stakeholder discussion on the call versus the BPM change process based on the inputs we receive. So I think that's all I have to talk about in the deck here today. I'd ask if there are any questions that I could help with up front.
Yeah, we have a hand from Kanya. Kanya, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, this is Kanya Dorland with the Public Advocate's Office, and I actually think what you just discussed is related to FERC 1920 because it requires a new reevaluation requirement for FERC 1920 for long-term transmission projects under 3 conditions if the project's delayed. And it would jeopardize the ability for the project to meet the reliability needs, or if the project costs are significantly exceed what was originally provided when it was selected, or if there are significant changes in regulation to cause concern that the project would no longer meet the selection criteria. So if a competitively bid project has a significant project change that changes the cost, then seems like if the CAISO were to, in their compliance with 1920, develop like the threshold of when, a project's cost, if it's 10 or 20% more, requires a reevaluation of whether, you would select the project with the new cost. And this would address, not just, confirming that the project, is still just and reasonable, but also sort of developing, project cost review like SPPs. They have a project cost review that they've had in place for 10 years, where if, project costs, comes in 10 or 20% higher than what it was originally, they do reevaluate it and they consider whether to cancel it or make other changes. But they basically are monitoring the costs of the projects, from, initiation, before full construction. So there's a chance that a project could be canceled if the costs become too high. So I think that this last TPP cycle, there was a project that came in that the scope was changed because the cost of high HVDC lines was much higher, and so the scope was changed, and that raised a lot of questions for the utilities about, or for the SE and SDG&E and PG&E about the competitive bidding process, and allowing LS Power to continue with that project scope. But if the cost didn't exceed 10%, then it seems like if your tariff said that, like if a project scope could be changed and if the cost didn't increase beyond 10%, then it could go forward. But if it was like 20% more, then you'd have a reason to maybe reconsider the project. So I'm just saying if your compliance with FERC 1920 has thresholds for cost reevaluation, that could apply to competitive bidding, I think, too, as well. Or projects that are competitively bid as well.
So Kenya, thanks. Just trying to distill it down into the 2 components. You're right that the first question I raised around what is our process for deciding that a change is necessary which is part of the planning process, planning review. That part, I agree, does relate to FERC Order 1920, that could be some additional requirements, and we'll be taking a look at that. So I appreciate that. The part that I was actually thinking, which is not, and which is the other topic would be looking for comment on, is regarding how we make a decision once we've decided that a change is necessary, whether to rebid versus whether to cancel and rebid a project versus negotiate a change with the incumbent or the party that's already been awarded a competitive project. So thanks for helping identify that difference, because I should have been more precise about separating those two issues out. That the issue that I was referring to about wanting to discuss about perhaps being a topic for a BPM is regarding the second question, which is if, however we get there, we decide that a change is needed to a competitively awarded project, how we decide whether to cancel and rebid that new change versus negotiating the change with the awarded project sponsor. But I agree with you, the first topic about how the need for a change is identified, I laid out the current process, and if we need to make modifications to that as part of compliance with FERC Order 1920, we will do that as we work our way through those details. So thank you. But then I would also encourage people to think about the second question in providing feedback to us in particular about when we do have to make a change to a competitively awarded project, which is something we hope we don't have to do very often. What considerations should we be taking into account in that decision? So I hope that helps, and thanks for identifying that, because yes, I should have drawn a tighter distinction between the first question and the second question as I walk through this.
Yeah, I was just thinking the reevaluation criteria could be similar for competitively bid projects, that, you know, you have to change the scope or the cost is different, that you might have a similar criteria of whether you cancel or rebid is if the project exceeds the original cost by 10% or more or 20, you have the same criteria. Anyway, I saw similarities, so thank you.
And it'd be we're happy to see your comments on that.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kanya, for your question. We have Anish. Anish, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Anish Nand with the Northern California Power Agency. I just want to build a little bit on Kanya's question. What if the original competitive solicitation had a cost cap on it? What happens when you rescope it and the costs go up?
Well, that is generally, if it's an ISO-driven change, that is an exclusion under the cost cap. So that is a complication. So there's no doubt that competitively awarded projects with different variations of cost containment measures being built in are far more complex to manage as a result. So that is one of the, the issues that we have to deal with here, is that there is not uniformity on cost containment measures proposed by different winning project sponsors. And that's part of why this is a complicated issue.
Got it. Thank you, Neil. Appreciate understanding that if it's a ISO cause, there's an exclusion for that.
Generally, that's the case, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know of anyone who's ever volunteered to take the risk of if we rescope the project.
Okay, we don't have any other hands currently in queue.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And sorry, Elena, back to you.
Oh, No, sorry, Neil. I didn't know if you wanted to wrap up any more of this. So I just wanted to say that we will be taking questions that you can, or we'll be taking your comments that you can email to regional transmission, and they're due by end of day on March 27th, just for this piece and not the FERC 1920 update. And I'm going to hand it back to Danielle, I think. Do you have anything else to wrap up on this section before I close out?
No, I don't. Thanks, Elena.
Okay, so I just have one quick announcement. Just the Energy Matters blogs. If you want any insights on the ISO grid or market operations, you can be on the lookout for our blog, and you can always subscribe to receive these as they come out. And with that, thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational convenience purposes, and the video file will be posted to the miscellaneous meeting page. Probably the easiest way to get to that is from today's calendar event from the calendar. Thank you for joining. Have a good rest of your day.